So I've made a couple of videos on this in the past, but since the organization has changed its interpretation of certain passages about shunning, I'm going to make another video about shunning. This is probably going to be a long one. This isn't going to be going into the history of disfellowshipping within the organization. It's just going to be discussing the topic as to whether or not it is, in fact, scriptural to do so, or to practice disfellowshipping in the manner that Jehovah's Witnesses do. So the first issue is the process by which someone gets disfellowshipped. Nowhere in the scriptures does it say that if someone commits a sin, then 3 elders will have a secret meeting with that person and they will decide in behalf of the congregation whether or not that person is to be shunned or not. And in fact, if you read Matthew 18:15 through 17, Jesus seems to imply that the disfellowshipping decision would be a decision that the entire congregation would make collectively. He says if they commit a sin, go and reveal his fault between you and him alone. Then if he doesn't listen to you, then take another brother along with you. And then if he doesn't listen to that brother or the 2 brothers that you bring along with you, then you bring the situation before the congregation. And if he still doesn't listen to the entire congregation, then he will be treated as a Gentile or a man of the nations or a tax collector. Now, none of that implies that someone would be shunned because the Jews did not shun these people. In fact, the Jews treated these people similarly to the way that Jehovah's Witnesses treat people who they would refer to as worldly. They don't have a lot of super close contact with those people, but they certainly don't shun them. And if we're going to talk about biblical principles, another reason that these cases were out in the open for everyone to see the evidence is so that corruption could be at a minimum. The Jews held the cases at the city gates so that everyone could see the cases and could see the evidence that was presented. In fact, the Watchtower references this in itself and says that the court was situated at the city gates so that there was no question about the trial being public. No doubt the public trials helped influence the judges toward carefulness and justice, qualities that sometimes vanish in secret star chamber hearings. You know, the same kind that Jehovah's Witnesses use for their disfellowshipping arrangement. So as I said before, there's no evidence and nowhere in the scriptures that you can point to find the process that Jehovah's Witnesses currently use to disfellowship someone. And in my view, I believe that the scriptures point to a very different process that isn't used by the organization, specifically so that they can keep things under wraps and prevent certain information or certain things from coming to light. And to be generous to their position, they also are at risk of being sued for slander. But like I said, we're discussing whether or not their process is biblical, and it is not. So the second issue is how disfellowshipped ones are treated. So there are currently 4 different punishments that you can receive if you get in trouble in the organization. You can be reproved, and that reproof can be public or private. You can be marked if they think that you're really bad and the congregation needs to stay away from you, and you can be disfellowshipped if they think that you need to be removed from the congregation entirely. If you are reproved and that reproof is private, then the elders will not make an announcement to the congregation, but they will still likely remove some privileges from you. It's kind of like a slap on the wrist. If you're reproved and that reproof is public, then that's basically telling the congregation this person did something bad, but we feel like they're repentant, so you don't shun them, but just kind of treat them like a worldly person, basically. Hold them at arm's length so they can feel a little bit of social ostracism and feel guilty for what they did. However, if you're marked, this likely means that the congregation is going to treat you similarly to if you were disfellowshipped, where they recognize that you're bad association or you're a potential danger, like if it's somebody who was abusing children or something. And then finally, if someone is disfellowshipped, then they are completely kicked out of the congregation and they are shunned by everyone. However, with the latest governing body update, they are now allowed to say a greeting to someone who is disfellowshipped as long as that person is not considered an apostate. Oh, and they are also allowed to send them a text or a message inviting them to the Kingdom Hall. So they're still shunned, but they can receive a hello, basically. Now, 3 out of those 4 I do believe you can find support for in the Bible. Like I said before, it seems as though Jesus was pointing to 1 or 2 or even 3 people privately, interacting with someone and trying to correct a bad course. And then in terms of public reproof, I do believe that that is supported by the scriptures. However, the congregation would not be ignorant about what they were punishing someone for. Like I said, they would be privy to the evidence and they would know exactly why they were supposed to treat someone a certain way. But even so, they would just treat them as a worldly person. And I didn't specify this before, but for the purposes of this video, we're going to assume that the Bible is correct and also that it is univocal, which I don't personally believe either of those things, but I'm coming at this from the perspective of a believer. Now, I'm sure the first objection that a lot of witnesses are going to point to is the fact that Jesus isn't the only one who talks about someone being punished for wrongdoing in the congregation. This is the number one scripture that Jehovah's Witnesses use to justify their shunning practices. Paul lists several things that are considered sinful, like being sexually immoral, greedy, idolater, reviler, drunkard, extortioner, and then says that you should not eat with such people, and that you should remove them from among yourselves. In fact, the number one thing that the Jehovah's Witnesses point to justify their shunning practice is this phrase right here: stop keeping in company. So what does it mean to stop keeping in company with someone? What does it mean to not eat with them? And what does it mean to remove someone from amongst yourselves? So when we look at the Greek word that the organization translates as mixing in company, we see that it is used 3 times in the Bible. Twice in 1 Corinthians 5, which we've already read through, and then another time in 2 Thessalonians 3, verse 14. So here this same Greek word is used, and it says, if anyone is not obedient to the word through this letter, keep this one marked and stop associating with him so that he might become ashamed, and yet do not consider him an enemy, but continue admonishing him as a brother. Admonishing involved like speaking to and instructing and encouraging someone. So obviously the biblical authors did not understand this term as meaning having absolutely no contact and not even speaking with someone. In fact, one of the only justifications for the organization saying that you were not supposed to speak to someone who was disfellowshipped is because they had arbitrarily taken the scriptures in 1 Corinthians 5 and combined them with the scriptures in 2 John, which they now finally admit are talking about 2 very different things.
But doesn't 2 John 9-11 tell us not to say a greeting to anyone who's been removed from the congregation? In examining the context of those verses, the governing body has concluded that the Apostle John was really describing apostates and others who actively promote wrong.
Ironically, apostates have been pointing this out for decades, but the organization is finally willing to admit that they were wrong. And I'm sure it has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that they lost their registered religion status in Norway due to their shunning policies. But anyway, as I pointed out, this instruction to not keep company with somebody who is committing these acts goes in line with what Jesus had said about treating someone as a worldly person or as a tax collector. Like I said before, they wouldn't be shunned, they just wouldn't have really close personal fellowship with that person. And it's also important to point out the context of this instruction that Paul gives, because it was in response to a situation where someone had taken as a wife or as a lover his father's wife, or like his stepmom, I guess. I hope it was his stepmom. And so in response to this situation, Paul gives this instruction. The organization itself points out that this situation was spoken about again in the second letter to the Corinthians. And Paul said something very interesting. He says that this rebuke was given by the majority of the congregation. So not only do I believe that this person was not shunned in the way that Jehovah's Witnesses shun people, but also it wasn't even the entire congregation. So who were the minority who abstained from this rebuke? It doesn't tell us, but we can only assume that this would be like the close friends and family of the individual. The last thing I'm going to squeeze in here is this concept of not eating with someone. The organization chooses to render it as not even eating with such a man, but they end up showing their bias in translating it that way, because the Greek simply says to not eat with such a person, because eating with someone in Bible times meant something far more than it does today. In fact, the organization even recognizes this. This is a quote from the Inside Book under the topic of food. It says that eating together would indicate a bond of fellowship. We see this cultural issue play out with a situation between Peter and Paul, where Paul points out that Peter, before these men from Jerusalem came who were circumcised, used to eat with the people of the nations, but all of a sudden when these people came around, he stopped eating with them. Now there's no indication that Peter was shunning these people, but he was removing this act of signifying his fellowship with them. So again, eating with someone was a culturally significant thing to these people. Is part of why it was considered such a big deal for Jesus to be eating with tax collectors and sinners. So the disfellowshipping process and the treatment of disfellowshipped ones as it's currently practiced by Jehovah's Witnesses is not biblical. Okay, so this is part 2 discussing the topic of is shunning slash disfellowshipping biblical. If you want to watch part 1, you can click on this link here. In the last video, I talked about a bunch of different scriptures, but in this video, I'm just going to stick to these specific scriptures. Like I said in the last video, the organization for many years had arbitrarily combined the scriptures in 1 Corinthians 5 with these scriptures here in 2 John. So the justification for their shunning practice was kind of an amalgamation of these two unrelated scriptures. Because in 2 John, John is talking about a very specific teaching and a very specific issue that the first century Christians were dealing with. Most scholars believe that John was directly trying to contradict a group or a sect of Christians that had arose during this time called the Gnostics, who were essentially pushing the idea that Jesus had never come in the flesh, that he had only appeared to assume a fleshly body, but in reality he had never actually been a human. And John was rejecting this idea. And then John goes on to say that anyone who does not bring this specific teaching about Jesus actually being a flesh and blood human, that anyone who rejected that teaching would not be brought into their homes, or you would not say a greeting to that person. Now, it's important to understand the context of this scripture, because inviting someone into your homes in the context of the first century, when we're talking about the first century Christians, inviting someone into your home was to worship with them. There was no churches or kingdom halls in the first century. Meetings or gatherings were held in individuals' homes. So he was telling them, do not invite this person into your home. Do not share in worship with them. And then you have this odd part at the end here where it says, do not say a greeting to him, for he that says a greeting to him is a sharer in his wicked works. So it's important to understand what that word actually means, because it really doesn't make sense that you would be a sharer in someone's works just by saying hello to them. And that's because this Greek word does not convey the idea of simply saying a greeting to someone or saying hello to them. This is praising them, saluting them, hailing them, rejoicing in their efforts. So essentially what John is saying is that you should not invite these people into your homes and worship with them, nor should you praise them or exalt them. But the governing body expands this instruction from John regarding this one specific issue to involve any disagreement that anyone might have with any of their teachings or policies. But as I already brought out, that is not the context of this instruction whatsoever. But for argument's sake, let's say that this was instruction meant to be applied to every single teaching within the Christian religion, that anyone who expressed any disagreement with anything was to be treated in this manner. Even though we know that wasn't the case, because the entire chapter of Romans 14 is talking about the disagreements of the early Christians and the fact that they had different opinions as to how they should behave, and yet they were still united. United in the sense that they had several core doctrines and teachings that they all shared, and then they had various opinions on other things. So I guess actually for argument's sake, let's say that this applies to those core doctrines that are super important to the point where someone would need to be removed and you would not invite them to worship with you. The problem with the organization's interpretation of this scripture as applying to any of their teachings is the fact that their teachings change. So even if this wasn't just talking about this singular issue about whether Jesus had actually had a fleshly body or not, and rejecting those who didn't come and bring that teaching to the congregation or to the homes of the individuals worshiping, even if this instruction was meant to refer to any of the core important doctrines within Christianity, the organization would then be put in a box where they would not be allowed to change those doctrines. If you're going to elevate your opinions and your teachings to this level, then they are teachings that you are not allowed to change. Because Galatians makes it very clear that even the apostles were not allowed to change the good news and change the message. And if they were to change the good news, and if they were to change the message that had been given to the congregations, then they would be accursed. You can't have it both ways. If you are going to make the claim that this scripture is referring to all Christian doctrines, not just this one specific doctrine being talked about, but all of them, and all of the gospel message, then any of the things that you place into the category of being able to disfellowship and cast someone out and not say greeting to them can never be changed. Otherwise, you would be guilty of transgressing this set of scriptures. So, to sum it up, this scripture was talking about one specific issue and one specific teaching that the early Christians were told to reject and not invite into their worship or to praise. Their organization elevates their opinions that they write in the Watchtower to this same level as this core early Christian doctrine. Then they incorrectly apply the treatment that John told the early Christians to apply to the people bringing them this teaching to all teachings, or I should say, all teachings contrary to what they teach. And then they repeatedly change those teachings, violating this scripture. So, like I said before, even if you could try to claim that this scripture was talking about treating every disagreement with like the fundamental core doctrines of Christianity, that this is how you're supposed to treat someone, you still would be left in the position where the governing body would thereafter not be allowed to change any of those doctrines, or else be guilty of declaring a new or false good news that went beyond their previous good news. But I find it kind of ironic that the governing body grants themselves the ability to change their doctrines when that is something that even the apostles said that they didn't grant themselves. So the governing body claims that they do not have the gift of prophecy like the apostles did, and yet they still elevate their opinions to what is supposedly inspired scripture. And then, after putting their opinions on par with the words of the apostles and punishing people in the same manner as someone would be punished for contradicting the words of the apostles, they then go and change their doctrines, thus making them guilty of violating this scripture and bringing forth a false good news, or a different good news than what was previously preached. Meaning that if they're correct about their interpretation of this scripture, then they are the ones who are supposed to not be received into their homes or to be said a greeting to. But again, like I said, I just find it kind of funny. Anyway, I know that was a lot of redundancy and I said the same thing like 8 times, but I wanted to hammer the point home. Because the organization does not seem to want to admit that the scriptures that they are using to justify their practices don't actually support the actions that they are taking. The fact of the matter is that any religious leader that bans alternative ideas or alternative perspectives from being voiced is either acutely aware that what they are saying is not going to hold up to scrutiny, or they're completely convinced that their adherents are either incompetent or credulous. In fact, they would have to believe that they're so ill-equipped that simply hearing dissenting opinions would be enough to sway them, which again brings into question the quality of your arguments as well as the quality of your adherents. And that might just be because you know exactly how easy it was for you to deceive them, therefore you know that it will be easy for others to deceive them as well. Or you know how easy it will be to expose your deception. Anyway, that's the end of my video. I'm done ranting. If you managed to make it through both videos, I'm impressed.